If Henry of Monmouth had considered an injury he might sustain in battle, the one he'd likely not consider would be an arrow embedded so deep in his face that to extract it would require the invention of a brand new tool. And yet, this was the precise injury he would obtain.
Once upon a time in history.
Hello history nerds, and welcome to the very first episode of Once Upon a Time in History. I'm your host Bonnie. You may know me as HistoryonCrack from TikTok, and I am very excited to be launching this podcast. Now, before I lead myself into a vaguely relevant ramble about myself, let's take on this thrilling tale of the young Henry V. But first, we must meet our protagonist. Introducing Henry of Monmouth. Due to the amount of men called Henry in this story, we will be nicking Shakespeare's nickname of Hal for Henry of Monmouth. Hal was a great-grandson of Edward III and would go on to show that he'd inherited the family's military prowess. He was born in September of 1385 to Henry Bolingbroke and Mary de Bohun, who were just 16 and 19 at the time. Little is actually known of Hal's childhood, other than him receiving a good education, which was expected. His parents were both music enthusiasts, so it seems quite likely that any musical talent Hal may have had was likely nurtured. There is some suggestion that Hal was a sickly child, with some historians finding suggestive evidence for this in the fact that his father seemed to favour the company of Hal's younger brothers, as more recordings have survived of the younger boys joining their father on travels. When Hal was 12, his father was banished from England, and Hal would find himself a ward of King Richard II. With King Dickon, Henry was first introduced to the battlefield in the form of a failed Irish campaign. There, after fighting heroically despite his tender age, Hal was knighted. He'd only be in the king's care for a year, as his father would return in want of his inheritance which the king had confiscated under the crown. This escalated to the deposition of Richard II and the ascension of Hal's father, now known to us as Henry IV. Despite what information we have with chroniclers such as Froissart leaving the impression that Hal and Richard had a good relationship, Hal's signature would be one of the ones signed to incarcerate the deposed king. Hal would now become Henry, Prince of Wales, and the High Sheriff of Cornwall. Hostility brews. It's 1403. And two opposing armies had gathered in a field of peas in Shrewsbury. On one side are the rebels, led by a man known as Henry Percy, nicknamed Harry Hotspur by the Scots on account of his speed and readiness. The other army is the English army, led by the king himself, Henry IV, and his son and heir and our main man, 16-year-old Prince Hal. The Percys had previously been big supporters of Henry IV and had received much in return for this. Henry IV had seemed a promising replacement for Richard II, but his shortcomings became evident far too quickly for the Percys' liking. This included financial issues which led to unpaid wages to the Percys, failures to negotiate with Owen Glendower, and the common fault of kings, favouritism, with one of those favourites being Henry's own son, Hal. As far as the Percys were concerned, their saviour from a tyrant had turned out to be a new shade of tyrannical. A strike of bad luck. After hours of the armies having each other in anticipation, it was the king who chose to be the offending side. Nearing dusk, the king rose his sword and his army charged, archers sending a shower of arrows ricocheting upon the defending opponents, striking down many men before they could come to hand-combat. But Percy's army of Cheshire bowmen proved superior in the exact same attack method, one unknowingly putting the line of succession in grave danger. Picture Hal astride his horse, bellowing commands at the left wing, his sword bared as he looked out at the swarm of enemies rampaging towards him. And then something crashed into his face, inches from his eye socket. We do not know the position of the visor on Hal's helmet. If it had been up, this hit seems more comprehensible. If it had been down, thus the arrow went through his viewport, then that would mean Hal was extremely unlucky. And yet, his personality radiated in this moment. He did not turn away. He carried on. Undeterred, he stayed with his army, displaying every trait seen admirable and desirable in any knight. He fought for his time in the bloody battle. Of the king's army, it was Hal's side that retained the most men at the end, and the royal army would be victorious. Hotspur had taken the field with the full intention of striking down the king. In what the king may have seen as divine intervention and a sign from the heavens, Harry Hotspur Percy was taken down when he lifted his visor and an arrow shot into his face. His death wasn't immediately realised, and his army was led to the misconception that the king had been slain. But Henry IV still stood, and when he heard the rebel army begin to cheer, "King Hotspur!" Henry responded by bellowing, "Henry Percy is dead." Still, confusion took the soldiers, and when the battle ended, many were unsure who was the victor. The identification of Hotspur's corpse soon settled that matter.
Back to camp. We can imagine the king leaving the field feeling triumphant, the troops crying out in success, cheering for their king, but soon a new concern became evident. Prince Hal, now no longer running on adrenaline and duty, was in agony. An arrow protruded from his face, the head of the arrow deeply embedded so it couldn't even be seen. Hal was rushed to a medical tent, where they immediately tried to extract the arrow. When the surgeon tore the shaft from Hal's face, he held a headless shaft. No arrowhead. The arrowhead had remained buried in Hal's cheek. Hal was given ale and a foul mixture that was to act as a painkiller. It was a concoction which involved opium and betony, all to assist with the pain as they tried desperately to remove the arrowhead to no prevail. But they discovered one glimmering piece of hope. It was a bodkin. If it had been another form of arrowhead, the only option for retrieval would have been to push it through to the other side of Hal's head, killing him. But a bodkin, often resembling a long spike or a diamond, could be extracted from the entry wound. They alerted the king of their failure, who responded with the order any father would give in this situation: save him. Hal was taken to Kenilworth Castle to be treated by the king's physician, Thomas Morstead. Hal remained in an intoxicated state and is said to have been a little delirious. The wound was likely showing signs of infection at this point, even just slightly. A young boy had the foul task of sucking the pus from the prince's gaping gash, so physicians could clean it and then coat it in honey. The physicians were lost and indecisive on their next course of action. They had the option of leaving the arrowhead in Hal's face, sewing up the wound and allowing it to heal over. But this came with the risk of the arrowhead migrating. Its current position may not be fatal, but if it were to move more than 1 inch in any direction, the prince could suffer brain damage and sudden death. If they were to make another attempt at removing the arrowhead, they risked disturbing its position. And that means they could kill the prince, and if they kill the prince, well, the king's going to have their heads for that. But A man was known, a man of great knowledge, an expert physician held in high regard for his abilities. In fact, he had been the king's personal physician. The problem was that he was in prison. Bradmore. John Bradmore had been a well-accomplished surgeon. He came from a physician family with both his brother and his son-in-law sharing the same occupation. Bradmore was evidently the more successful, and his surgical brilliance brought him to the royal court as a king's physician. Besides being a physician, he likely had a second trade. Surgeons commonly engaged in metalworking as a second trade, and Bradmore had been referred to as a gemster, so this likely means that he made jewellery. So, king's physician makes jewellery. Bradmore would have had a handsome salary, but the sinful hand of greed may have took over him in around 1402, when he was imprisoned under the suspicion that he had crafted counterfeit coins. He was certainly in a very good position to do such a crime, but if the accusation was true, it was certainly done out of greed rather than desperation. The king ordered for Bradmore's release and summoned him to Kenilworth to treat the prince. Bradmore kept an exhaustive account of his work on Hal. This is where we get most of this information from. He noted the precise position of the arrowhead to be on the left, beneath the eye and besides the nose, and embedded in the skull some 5 or 6 inches deep. From this, we can truly appreciate Hal's luck for not suffering instant brain damage and death. A medical feat. Disclaimer: if you have a sensitive stomach, please listen with caution. Bradmore deduced that no common practice for this form of injury was suitable. He also knew no way to repair Hal's damaged cheekbone. He wouldn't make an attempt at retrieval impetuously. He needed time to think. Instead, he ordered Morstead and the other attendants to have the wound sucked clean. Bradmore needed the best view possible of the arrowhead to retrieve it, and thus the wound needed dilating. In a process which would have further stretched the prince's agony, Bradmore enlarged the gaping wound with a series of probes. And this had to be done now, because Bradmore couldn't risk the wound healing, the opening shrinking. After this, the wound was filled with an anointment of Bradmore's own recipe, and it contained honey and elderflower. They then temporarily sealed the wound with a poultice made from flour, barley, honey, and turpentine. For some days, Hal was to receive care in an abbey. Daily he received herbal teas to boost his strength, and while he sipped his tea, probably feeling rather nauseous, the monks of the abbey sang. They would continue to sing for the entirety of his stay. Meanwhile, Bradmore expressed his medical genius. He invented a surgical instrument for the extracting. His manuscript, Philomena, which documents the operation, includes an illustration of the device. It was designed as a long rod that could be inserted into the bodkin socket and then expanded to fit tightly, essentially locking it into the head. This is now known as the Bradmore screw. Operation Save the Prince. The tension in the air must have been stifling as the operation began. If Bradmore failed, he may face worse than returning to his jail cell. In these moments, both Bradmore and Hal stood at the cliff edge. One faulted move and they both would fall. The wound was sucked clean, the probes removed to reveal the cavernous hole in the prince's face. Bradmore studied it before delicately penetrating it with his new invention. The screw met the socket of the arrowhead, and as Bradmore twisted, trying to keep the right amount of pressure, the arrow moved. It shot through the other side of Hal's nose. Bradmore had to use another tool to assist in pushing the arrow back towards its entrance. Unpleasantly, he did this via sticking the utensil up Hal's nostril. Then Bradmore tried again with the screw. This time he was certain he had a good hold. He rocked the arrow back and forth to edge it to the surface. He pulled, slowly freeing the Bog King from its fleshy cave. He had succeeded. The now empty wound was filled with white wine and then sealed again with the poultice. And the prince still breathed. Aftermath. Bradmore. Bradmore likely found his reputation refreshed. Henry IV showed his gratitude to Bradmore with a yearly sum of the equivalent of £4,000 a year and a royal pardon. He was a free man again. He returned as an attendant to Henry IV. Records have survived of payment from the king to Bradmore for medicine. In later years, Bradmore was appointed as a physician for William Winslow. Winslow had attempted suicide by stabbing himself in the gut. After a remarkable 86 days of treatment, Winslow joined the list of men saved from death by John Bradmore. Aftermath. Hal. It took 3 months for Hal to be in a fit state. This was likely 3 months of gradually improving agony for him, and 3 months of nervous waiting for all those involved in the operation as they awaited confirmation that he was indeed going to survive. Earlier, I referred to Hal as Henry V, a massive spoiler to the operation's success. We have a fairly clear idea of how this horror story affected Hal physically. Due to the damage to his cheekbone, it's quite likely that his face was asymmetrical and caused such characteristics as a drooping eyelid. His cheek was likely sunken in appearance. But saying this, and noting that both are common, neither were mentioned by Hal's contemporaries who gave their physical descriptions of him. What they did mention was a scar. Now, Shakespeare really played down the size of Hal's scar. If you've watched Netflix The King with Timothée Chalamet starring as an older Hal, you may not have noticed the small scar present on his cheek. This is certainly an underestimation. The scar would have been far more prominent. The actual size and appearance, we do not have any contemporary source that is detailed. But this is what we do know. In Bradmore's account, he states the scar is on Hal's left cheek. Studies of paintings and illustrations of Hal have put this into question, though. The most famous portrait of Hal is not a contemporary one, but it is well assumed to be a copy of one commissioned by Hal during his lifetime. Hal is depicted in profile from his left side, and he lacks a scar. Now, there are 2 simple explanations for the lack of scar. Number 1, the artist, whoever they were, beautified the king. They just left out the scar. And 2, Bradmore's referred to his own left, not Hal's left, meaning for Hal the scar was on his right cheek. This painting has also led to theories that the king was self-conscious and chose to be portrayed from what he considered his best side, thus the side without the scar. This brings us to a discussion on how the ordeal affected him mentally, something we can only theorize and guess. It is understandable that many assume the king to have been traumatized, with some suggesting his lack of humor being suggestive evidence, while others argue it was simply his display of authority. The problem is, studying his personality is a faulted way to find evidence of mental trauma due to the lack of clear examples of his personality prior to this injury. The problem is that studying his personality is a faulted way to find evidence of mental trauma, and this is due to the lack of clear examples of Hal's personality prior to his injury. We can find some earlier examples of Hal from chroniclers such as Froissart, but these are all subjected to the reader's perception. What we do know is that Henry V was described as hard, domineering, ruthless, and capable of cruelty. Perhaps, though he physically may have lived, survived, something may have died within Hal that day. Or perhaps he was always ruthless and cruel, and his survival left him thinking himself near indestructible. Who knows? The truth is lost to time. Hiya, I'm Bonnie, and thank you so much for joining me for my first ever podcast episode. This has been fairly stressful to record. Unfortunately, I became sick, so it took me 3 days to record this over a period of 8 days. I will, of course, in the future be investing in a much better quality microphone. If you'd like to stay up to date with future episodes, definitely follow me on Instagram and on TikTok. The next episode will be a Her Story episode. I haven't picked the Queen or Princess yet, but I'm very tempted to do Mary de Bohun, the mother of Henry V. Or maybe Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II, as out of all the women in history, she is the one whose life I am best versed in. Again, thanks for watching, History Nerds, and have a fabulous day, morning or night. Bye-bye!
Once upon a time, in history.